even today, when dates are printed, say out of the Soviet Union or Russia, they talk about the old style calendar and the new style calendar, for example. But the
Chinese messed us. You know, I used to know all the prophets in China until they changed all the damn names to conform
listen,
with the
holidays,
Western calendar.
so holidays, your approach to history as to what happened and what did not happen will necessarily be biased. It's going to be biased, and it is a struggle, and it's going to be very difficult to prevent this bias from filtering out whatever objective truth might be there, because this is always going to be open to some interpretation.
But you know, this Alliance for Civilization is very important, which is a counter to Huntington's Clash of Civilization, because within that framework, it's going to require all the civilizations to change their orientation toward history. Now, this is not going to happen immediately, you know. And secondly, Abdul Malik is leading the Arabic or Muslim thrust, and I had some problems with his. I have some problem with this guy too, because one thing they do neglect is the role, and they got their biases, is the role of Africa in this process.
That's all I was saying.
Now,
that's what all of my
he's
questions
not a European. Now, number two, but he's talking about, and there's another bias in that show you everybody got their bias. He's talking about China, the Muslim, and the Europeans. There's some deep-seated antagonism between the Muslims and the Hindus. How in the hell do you jump over India when you're talking about Alliance for Civilization? So I do not deny the fact that there are bias, but there are some people who have transcended, like Didi Kosambi, the great Indian writer. He attacks the bias in Greek history when they taught him that although the Magadhan Empire, like when you talk about atomic theory, if you read Indian materialism, the Greeks are not the only people who had atomic theory. In fact, I suspect there's what's called an age, they call it the axial age. One thing,
the question was
I said it, in which there was a crisis in the ancient world. I said it was the second axial age. You know what is common? Confucius, Confucius, Buddha, and Greek civilization all came of age about the same time, and they contend this. And they talk this about Attila is connected with the Volkswanderung, the grand wagon, what Russians call it, the grand vagabondage. The crisis after the Roman Empire, I suspect there was a crisis throughout the Eurasian landmass, where most of the world is. And Europe, according to him, is just a peninsula.
You know why you get no respect in the academy?
Who don't get any respect?
Producing and written.
But anyhow,
writing.
Okay, let's continue.
We were talking about the doctor? Talking about him? He's not writing there? I thought you were
I have
writing.
written quite a bit. And
Well, yeah, you're right. Well, that's what I'm doing.
May I say this?
Right,
Let me
yeah.
say this.
Nothing in a
When you read a book like this where people, not only American people, period, are in the minor leagues in terms of social science research.
Yeah.
And especially Black Americans. You only talk to each other. When you go see Karinga, you hear one view. He does not know about the studies and rejects them.
Well, he may know about them, but he don't deliver them to his audience.
Research is dead now. When you put stuff together in social science now, if you don't, that doesn't mean these guys don't have their bias. But if you ignore Didi Kosambi, the greatest scholar in India on these questions, Sanskrit Jnana is more Indiocentric.
Who shares this view that Didi Kosambi is the greatest?
Well, most people. That's
Mike, you share that? Do you share that view, Mike?
That's a dominant thrust.
Do you share that view?
Ancient India has a book.
Mike disagrees with you.
But what happens now?
If you're not, Mike disagrees with you.
I said this. At this stage of the game, it's not going to be easy. The stronghold of Western centrism is not Europe anymore. It's the United States. And I think there's a reason for it. It's the United
Run that by me again. What you say?
The stronghold of Eurocentrism.
Right on. Okay, yeah, okay. I got you.
Occidental centrism is the United States, and I thought Europe had traumatic 2 world wars fighting for world supremacy, and that changed your mind. And I can see in the literature, their works are more worldly. You know, they don't just quote each other. And but Afro-American work, not just the Afrocentrics, is extremely ethnocentric. Even all they do is discuss the relationship between Malcolm and Martin. You can't understand nationalism by doing that. Because I think our Scott, and they got on W.B. Du Bois' case, he was the most cosmopolitan scholar we had at that stage. But he worked the world in Africa and so forth. But it's not Afrocentric, so they couldn't pick him up.
Right, it was a worldview, right. I agree.
Yeah, it was a worldview. Now, what is happening now, not only in the field of ancient history, but I think the United States is the center of world reaction now. I think this is not the most reactionary country, but we're the stronghold of the past. Now, which based on Western dominance. Now, what is happening is Europeans and others are making compromise. Our allies in Europe are the right-wing Europeans. Our allies in Africa are the right-wing Africans. Like, for instance, and you can see it manifested in many ways. They just had a...
When you say our, what are you talking about?
United
US.
States.
Oh.
We are U.S. This is us.
Bandung. They had the 50th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, right? And they called for where 5 billion people were represented by the delegation. Of course, they had difference. And they called for an Afro-Asian strategic alliance. I brought that up in our little study group, and they dismissed it as irrelevant. What's relevant is the black-white relations and the diaspora and all that stuff. Now, what happened, to show they weren't confining, the next meeting they had, a month later, was at the Non-Aligned Conference. Where did they meet? To show the Latinos you were part of, they met in Havana, Cuba. Oh, but we don't like Castro. But the New African magazine just wrote a whole issue dedicated to Castro. And the Chinese summit with Africa was received more highly than the European summit. Well, you don't know about this. But the point, because they aren't telling you, in China, you might think they have all these relations with us, but I know for a fact from reading the Financial Times that the total Chinese trade with Europe and the United States is 40% of their trade. 60% is with Africa, Asia, and Latin America. In a very short time, it might be up to 80. Let me tell you where the world is going. And the center of the world, and I can give you an article on that, the center of the world trade is going to go back to where the center of world trade has been throughout most human history.
I'm going to get real tight now. I want you to tell me where the world is going.
Going to be. It's already, I just read an article. The Indian Ocean, they developed a comprehensive India, China, railroad system coming across Russia into Central Asia, going into Europe, down into Mumbai, that's the railroad system, and going into Pakistan, Iran said we want to join it. And you better believe that in the future we aren't going to use 25% of the oil and gas of the world, which means we're going to make a whole lot of adjustment. We're only 3% of the world's population. Why should we use 25% of oil and gas in the world? You think that's going to go on forever?
Well, because we had the planes, we had the guns, we had we had Mike as a Marine out there fighting for it. We had Dr. Black,
You didn't read today's Financial Times by the head of the Council of Foreign Relations, did you?
No, I did not.
Richard Haas, the Council of Foreign Relations, paper today, he had another article yesterday because it wasn't in black pledge. What follows American dominion? He's president of the Council of Foreign Relations.
Let me see that headline again. Put it back over there. Let me see that headline.
A unipolarity world for about 20 years.
Financial Times.
What happened 20 years ago? The overthrow of the communist world. We used to have a bipolar world. He said we're not
16.
That's today. We're not going back to the bipolar world. He said it ain't gonna be China, United States. That's a myth. It ain't gonna even be a multipolar world. He said multipolar world is some people have the ideas as they had before World War II in Europe of putting the great powers together and letting them run the rest of the world. And these guys are proposing that Japan, China, India, Russia, Europe, and the United States get together and run the rest of the world. But this guy, who's head of the Council of Foreign Relations, which is upper class, produce foreign affairs, says it's going to be a non-polar world. Non-polarity is the future. So there are people who are thinking outside this framework. And I think,
and he's not the only one.
May I say this? At one time, Afro-Americans were at the cutting edge.
Yeah, Soros, something like that too, right?
Soros said this is the end of era. There's an article in the New York Times just a couple of days ago. Soros made $4.2 billion last year,
I'm skeptical
which is
of him.
10 times as much money, 100 times as much money as all
Nobody told Bush
the players
about
in the NBA.
unipolarity.